So this week's project comes from, well, an unknown source out of the Ukraine. I was just kind of perusing through eBay listings when I stumbled across this, and I don't know if it's original to that sculptor or if it's original to someone else. All I know is I couldn't find this sculpt anywhere else, so I assumed it belonged to them. And I absolutely love it. I've loved it for a long time, and I've had a lot of interesting ideas on how I wanted to paint this figure. And I would love to get my hands on some more to do more of it, to do different paint schemes. But for now, I only had the one, and I felt it was about time. However, I oftentimes use the phrase paint boldly, as imbued by some of my favorite YouTubers, but I don't oftentimes go bold enough. I decided to go with much brighter colors than I typically do, and took a step out of the grim dark that I'm so used to. I feel that the grim dark paint scheme has become quite a comfort zone for me, and I really need to push far and push past it. Hope you guys will agree that this one turned out pretty great. Let's take a look at how I did it. So typically when we work on models, one of the things that we want to do is we want to wash the model. In fact, we want to wash it almost immediately to get all that mold release off. And one of the issues with working with a large backlog that I've had for a while is I typically wash the model immediately, unless it's a brand that I know I don't need to worry about it. And as a direct result of that, when I work with garage kits like I do with a lot of my busts like we're working with today, I just find myself forgetting to do that. And now I'm having to pay the price because the primer is not sticking to the model, let alone if I attempt to do anything else. So we're gonna do some cleanup here with a brush and some rubbing alcohol and kind of give it a rough cleanup and see how that goes. Now, I've never done anything like this before. Usually if I had an incident like this, I would just strip the model down entirely and start again. But I want to see if I can salvage this to show you guys that if this is something that you also forget sometimes, you may not need to 100% start over. Perhaps just a quick wash down of rubbing alcohol will do. So let's give it a shot. So obviously that didn't work, so I decided to go with a tried and true method. Now this seems to work really well for me, and your mileage may vary depending upon the type of mold release, but if you put any kind of an enamel over the top of it, like a gloss coat or in my case a dull coat, it will lock those chemicals down, so you don't really have to strip the model down all the way. And then you can just put another layer of primer on top of it. Now in my case, I'm using a surface primer that's really nice and thin by Vallejo, and I don't have a problem with putting 2 layers of primer down. But if you are in a situation where you're using a very fine detailed model and maybe using spray primers, which can tend to gunk up detail if you put too many layers down, you may decide that just stripping your model down with some rubbing alcohol and starting over again is your better bet. Now you can see me here applying on a bit of a thicker coat on the bottom. You'll see that this is still wet even when I'm done applying the rest of the primer. Now I do this for 2 reasons. Number one, I'm trying to show you that you can use primer when it's been over thinned. It'll still work, but it will just be kind of soupy. It's gonna cling into those details and kind of obscure details, and it's also going to take forever to dry. Now you can use this to your advantage because when it's over thinned, it's going to add a bit of texture to your piece. So if you were to spritz over and over again and just kind of off and on, you can build up some texture on what would normally be a relatively flat surface. So perhaps if you were trying to do, let's say, a bust of a Nurgling or something, you could help build up some rust textures on any kind of metal simply by adding a little bit of speckling with your primer layer. However, obviously we're not going for that here, so I go ahead and add a little bit more paint, and that kind of sorts things out and eliminates my problem, and I just put on some nice thin layers after that. So I got asked in a TikTok live the other night, is there anything I can do for priming when the weather is foul? And so I am not an expert on the cold, as I live in Central Florida, so humidity is kind of the big battling factor here. And one of the big things I have been told is that if you prime inside your garage, it can make a world of difference. And I imagine if you have a space heater, you could use a space heater in your garage and perhaps create a much better environment if you're up north. However, when dealing with humidity here in Florida, I have an indoor spray booth, but before I got an indoor spray booth, I did what you're seeing here. I put on my face mask and I sprayed directly out of an open door. Now, that having been said, you want to try and put a fan behind you, or at least have some kind of fan going in the room to circulate the air, and give it a minute or two before you remove your face covering, just to let any chemicals that may be in the air dissipate. And that's honestly the best advice I can offer you. Now, is that necessarily the best advice? From a safety standpoint, probably not. This is one of those cases of I shouldn't, but I do. And I really try to use my spray booth as often as possible, even though a lot of times it ends up just being a big cubby hole. When you guys see me using an airbrush here at my desk, it is the only time I am using an airbrush at this desk. I will always use it inside the spray booth unless I'm recording. So I wanted to start out with a nice bright blue, something that would work good as a base tone for a bit of an experiment that I wasn't quite sure if it was going to work, and in certain places it did. It didn't quite work in the face the way that I wanted it to, but it was a good place to start nonetheless. So I'm starting off with a very bright, almost whitish blue. Now this is Fenrisian blue for those of you who are interested in that information, but any light blue, any kind of icy color would work just fine if you want to follow along at home. Now once I went back in and kind of solidified a few places and kind of blended the color out a bit, I end up adding a little bit of contrast Slaneshi purple. Now if you don't have contrast paint, simply making a dark purple wash and then adding that to the paint would be fine. The reason I say to go with a wash is because of just how diluted we end up with. This color ends up really close to Demonette Hide, and honestly I should have reinforced it a little bit and put a little bit more darker colors in, but that's fine, we can fix it down the road. So I'm taking a little bit of inspiration from some airbrush artists I saw on YouTube a long time ago, where they used a fishnet on top of a part that they were airbrushing to create this scale-like pattern. Now I'm taking this one step further because of the small scale, and I'm using a little bit of wedding veil here. And it just has these really nice, lovely little patterns. Now, in the places where it pulls taut closest to the skin, that works best, and if I'd used a toothpick to kind of hold things down in the recesses and shadows, I probably would have been a lot better off. I feel like maybe using some self-adhesive stencils would work great if you have that as an option to you. I just didn't happen to have anything like that on hand and just wanted to give it a shot. And I think it worked great where it worked, but in other places it didn't quite work, and when I tried blending things in, I went a little bit darker than I probably ought to have. But that's fine, we can brighten things up with a little more Fenrisian gray sprayed from above, similar to a Zenithal Prime. For right now, I just want to go ahead and put a little bit of Slaneshi purple mixed in with ultramarine blue from contrast, and go ahead and put those into the recesses and places where I really want to darken the colors up. I end up pushing this a lot further by adding Druchii Violet down the road, but we'll talk about that when I do that. In the meantime, it was time to fix the face and to kind of add a little bit of that brighter color back into the crown of the head where I wanted it, back up to that original Fenrisian gray. And I will not be using the airbrush going farther from this. Now, if I really wanted to, could I? Yeah, I could probably use the airbrush a little bit more, but I wanted more brush control going forward, especially around these horns. Now, initially I wanted to go with a bit more vibrant colors on the horn. I was planning to base this in XV88 and then dramatically go up from there, but I actually end up using XV88 mostly as our base tone. Now, if you wanted things to be a bit brighter, you could start out with an Ashanti bone and then put several layers of washes down. I wanted to use my washes more sparingly, especially because I had done a lot of blending with an airbrush. I knew that if I went really heavy with a wash, it just wasn't going to look right. I needed to use washes in strategic places, mostly meaning that I needed to make sure that they just don't end up all over the place, that they go in places where they are going to serve a purpose, mostly meaning things like panel lining. So for this, I decided to take a step back from like a super high fantasy standard, which was what I was originally going to go for, and start looking into more realistic paint schemes and more realistic bone, which is what I see this as. Now I can also see this done up in many different colors, purples, greens, yellows, and oranges, and I would love to do this bust again and perhaps choose to do some of those other wider range colors in these horns. But for now, I was very happy with where everything ended up, and let's talk about some of these other colors that I end up laying in. Now for anybody at home who really wants to know what's going on here, I'm using a mixture of colors, and I'm using my wet palette to my advantage to get a range of colors between 4 main shades of brown and bone color. So I'm using XV88 as my base tone, but I'm also mixing it into other colors, and I think this is kind of helping to tie everything all together. The other colors that I end up using quite a bit of is Ogren Camo, Xandri Dust, and Ushapti Bone. Now, I go very sparingly with my Ushapti Bone, but everything else I actually mixed quite heavily and did 3 or 4 different layers of each of those with progressively lighter and lighter touches, meaning that where I'm drawing all these little lines and I'm kind of accentuating a lot of those raised edges. Now one thing I'll admit I got pretty carried away with here is I shouldn't have put as many highlights on the back sides of the horns in places where the shadows should be, and I could knock those down quite easily using something like an Agrax Earthshade or a Seraphim Sepia. But I'm just going to leave it as is because I do really like the way that it looks. I like how vibrant it is. In my mind, it almost gives a semi-translucent look, as though the lighting in the room is actually passing all the way through the horns, but not necessarily acting like a reflector. It's not casting light upon her face, or the rest of her body. It's simply just illuminated by the light source in the room. Now, in addition to the horns, I also went ahead and took care of the lips and the stripe down the face. I went ahead and put a red stripe anywhere where it looked like the skin was split. I'd like to think that it's not necessarily skin, but more of an exoskeleton, and we're kind of seeing that soft layer underneath, which is why I kind of opted with red. It's not only going to be a contrasting color to the blue skin and kind of help pop when you're looking at it straight on, but it's something that's kind of more identifiable. I also started off with giving her more yellowish orange lips, and then I really like the idea of going with green and adding some green into the eyeshadow. And then I went ahead and I blocked out all the black on the armor. Now, a while back we talked about on this channel with painting with the mother color, and in that video I talked about how it's important to add a base color into your other colors. So in the case of the horns here, we added XV88 into almost every layer of paint that we added on top of it, which is why we end up with such smooth blends, and that is why the contrast in the pinstriping that we'll be doing later becomes so much more apparent, because that XV88's not there. I wanted to add this mother color in the sense of highlights as well. With using Fenrisian gray in the skin, I wanted to bring it into the black and use that for the edge highlight, so that when I put a gloss on top of it later, it was really going to pop. I want to take a second while I go ahead and knock out some of these little minor details to give a big massive thank you to Brandon, my first ever patron. So thank you guys so much for all those who've shown me love and support, but thank you so much to Brandon for really believing in what we're doing. This isn't the first time Brandon's helped out the channel, whether it be through commissions or other means. Thank you so much, my friend. And to anybody else that would like a shout out, please consider going over to Patreon and subscribing to one of the tiers. I believe my cheapest tier is currently set to $2. And for $2 a month, you can really help out this channel and get it so that I can spend more time making the same kind of content, or if not better type of content than what I'm currently making. I'd really love to be able to do this full time, and it's not possible without the support of the patrons, especially while the channel is this small. So thank you very much, my friend. So as my project kind of dragged on more and more today, and I used the term dragged on lightly, as I actually really started to enjoy this model. I switched from painting for the sake of a tutorial to painting for the sake of painting, and just really enjoying my time and myself. I decided to go with some kind of yellow vaguely reflective or translucent eye color. I wanted something that felt very otherworldly, but I also wanted something that didn't just glow like headlights. And so I kind of played around with how I applied layers of color here to try and give off the illusion of eye sockets. And so you'll see me try a few different combinations of yellow before settling on what we ended up using in the end. Aside from some Druki Violet in places to kind of bring out shadows and things, I really wanted the horns to feel as though they weren't entirely translucent, and I wanted to do that by adding in some recessed shading and some panel lining. So I used my recessed shade with Doombull Brown and my panel lining with Rhinox Hide. I ended up mixing both of these paints with a little bit of Flow Aid just to kind of help them flow a bit better. Could I have used something like panel liner from Tamiya? Absolutely. However, the Tamiya panel liner is unfortunately almost the exact same color as XV88. So if I had used it, it would have blended in quite well, which means I would have had to have used something like gray or black, or even mix the two colors. And honestly, why mix it when I could just make it myself? Now, I did forget to go ahead and film myself when I did the Druki Violet, despite how much I talked about it throughout the entire process. I'm sorry, guys. You're just gonna have to trust that it's there and notice that in certain places it's darker, especially in the cheeks and the bottom of the breastplate area. Now, I am blending in this horned cowl a little bit more with the skull by coming back in and using a mixture of Seraphim Sepia and Agrax Earthshade. Now this is more on the Seraphim Sepia side and just kind of helping to blend everything in. I went heavy on the Seraphim Sepia as I knew that the red tones that exist in the Seraphim Sepia, that red-yellow color, goes real well with Doombull Brown and would kind of blend in with what I was already doing. I also put a little bit on the back of the crown of the head just to kind of blend places in with where these horns are connecting in with the skull, and I decided to call it there. The only thing I really did is I went ahead and glossed the eyes and I glossed the black armor, but other than that, it's all done. And there you have it, folks. A alien bust. I absolutely love this character and how she turned out. And thank you again to Brandon for our first Patreon, as well as naming this beautiful bust. Thank you so much for the inspiration, my friend. You are awesome. And thank you so much to everybody for all the love and support. You guys have been awesome. Again, there are a lot of great ways to help support this channel in the Linktree. Everything from buying models for the channel for us to do, as well as just straight up donations, the Patreon. And if you can't do any of that, well, there's a really great way for you to support this channel, and that is simply to subscribe, to like the video, to leave a comment, and to share this around with other hobby friends, and maybe get them involved in the channel as well. Thank you guys so much for all the time, all the love, and all of the support, and until next time, may your display case always be filled, and your pile of shame never run empty. Thank you. I sound so stopped up. I hate allergy season.